I was halfway through my notes as they are now, and I realized I've only covered 2 verses. So, I'm going to take things a little bit longer tonight, uh, and we'll see about what follows. We'll see if I'm teaching next week or if Ongrith wants to take it. But let's do a little review. Last week, what did we talk about?
Looking for my notes.
Yes, Wash, even if his name was not mentioned. What specifically about Jesus? Yeah, we kept talking about the Jews. We've done an awful lot of talking about the Jews. Ever since all the way back in chapter 9, haven't we? We talked about Paul's desire to see them be saved and about God's choices regarding his chosen people, and last week specifically, God's promises and plans going forward with the Jewish people. And now we come to one of one of these really amazing parts of the book of Romans. Uh, this is a part that ties together a lot of the book. Everything that we've talked about up to this point has kind of led one thing into another. This is a part where everything kind of coalesces and you really get to see the big picture. And that's really cool to me. It ties together the entirety of the book to identify throughout the whole of history what God's been doing, what God has been up to since we started talking in the book of Romans back in chapter 1. Uh, but more importantly, maybe, is not what God's been doing, but what he's going to do. So, with that in mind, let's get someone to read verses 11 through 16 of chapter 11. Will be second. Apparently, there is no one named someone. I mean, I'll read it if I have to. All right, Kessa, I see your light. Go ahead.
11 through 16.
Yes, ma'am.
So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now I am speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as firstfruits is holy, so is the whole lump, and if the root is holy, so are the branches.
Thank you. All right. Got 2 open Word documents. Every time I Alt Tab, I pick the wrong one. So, up to this point, we've managed to understand that at this point in history that we're talking about right now, when the book of Romans has been written, Israel, en masse, on the whole, has rejected the Messiah, Jesus Christ, because he didn't fit what they thought the Messiah was supposed to be. You know, they imagined this military Messiah was going to come save them from the bondage of Rome. They weren't picturing the suffering and gentle, meek Messiah who came to save not from military might, but from the bondage of sin. And since the Jews rejected that, there was an entirely new work that was begun. It was one that was so radical and so completely unheard of that the Jews, both the Jews that were saved and the Jews that were unsaved, they just pretty much threw collective fits when this idea was presented to them. What was this idea? Yeah, Those people. Who are those people? Yeah, Gentiles. By the way, I just want to confirm there's somebody else here other than Kessa. Okay, good. You guys are just awfully quiet. Okay. So we've gone. So this plan, go to the Gentiles. Go to the Gentiles? Gentiles? And every Jew was like, what? We've never done that. You know how long we've been on this planet, God? We've never gone to the Gentiles. Well, you know, that was the plan. And the message of salvation moved from Israel to the masses of the Gentiles throughout the world. Now, clearly, that presents a problem for the Jew. First off, God is now working through the Gentiles. Does that mean that God is no longer using the Jew? Does that mean that God has rejected the Jews? What was he done with them? Had they blown their one shot with God so that now he had completely moved on from them? Not a rhetorical question.
Um,
Yes, Kessa.
but it is a trick question, isn't it?
Not intended to be, no. I mean, if you want to make it one, yes, I suppose you can make it one. But in all honesty, the answer is no. No, and we'll explain this. I mean, give me what you're thinking. Why the answer is yes and no. I think I know what you mean, but I want to make sure that I'm not glossing over something that. Uh, by and large, you're correct. Ah, now that's where we disagree. Hold on to that. We'll come back to it. All right. We've covered this phrase a bunch throughout Romans. But Paul says, you know, did the Jews stumble in order that they might fall? What does he say? Meginomai. God forbid, by no means. And it's here where we really start to see the grand scope of the hand of God as it moves throughout history. Because remember, the Jews were God's chosen people, right? We covered that way back in Genesis chapter 11 when God makes the Abrahamic covenant. He says, I will make of you a great nation. And all that jazz. Remember that? God chose Abraham to be the father of a great nation there. But for the moment, they had rejected God's offer to them. But did that mean that God would disown them?
That's the question, isn't it?
This is the question. But again, think back to the Abrahamic covenant. Through you, God said, speaking to Moses, heaven help me, Abraham, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Okay? And that was the promise of the Messiah, but know just who God included in that statement. Who did he say would be blessed? Pretty much everyone. Yeah. You know who that includes? It includes the US, it includes Russia, and it includes the Jews. God had not forsaken the Jews. And the further we get into the study, we'll cover this a little bit more. But this is not a forsaking of the Jews. This is the whole point of this passage is to show that God has not forsaken or rejected the Jews. The Jews had rejected God's offer to them, but God has not rejected them. He is still working with Israel, just in an interesting way. All right? You know, in fact, this was God's plan from the start. God promised salvation to the Gentiles through the Messiah. Why? To get the Jews' attention. All right? So let's just say for grins and giggles, that you have a best friend that you play with like all the time. All the time. Whenever, whether it be, or you do stuff, you go hiking or you play online with them, like stuff like, PUBG or what have you, or just going and like, playing football or tag or who knows. You're always with this person. This person is your absolute best friend. And this friend really wants to get your attention about something. But let's just say that you aren't really paying attention. Let's just say that you're so caught up in whatever the activity is that you're doing that you don't notice that your friend is trying to tell you something or trying to let you know something. What's a really good way to get you to pay attention? What's a good way to make you notice your friend if you're not paying attention to him? And how would you do that, Kessa? What if your friend suddenly went over and started playing with someone else? Why would you go start playing with someone else? Why would that get his attention? Because it makes you jealous. If you love being with this person and you enjoy their presence so much, seeing them with someone else makes you jealous because it's not you. And that's what God was doing to the Jews. They had missed what God was doing. So how does God go about getting the attention of these chosen people of his? Start working with someone else. And not just anyone else. It had to be those heathen Gentiles. Those pagans that had never known God or even pursued him. Those dark-hearted, foul-mouthed, unclean idolaters who never had a taste for the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords in all their lives. Why do you think the Jews got so upset about Paul's preaching salvation to the Gentiles? Why do you think that was? Did you ever stop to consider, why are the Jews so mad? Because they saw the preaching to the Gentiles as a perversion of the right to God that was theirs and theirs alone. He was their God, and nobody else could claim him. He was the God of the Jews, and that was it. And so when the gospel went to the Jews, that was the plan, to get the Jews mad, to get them jealous of God's work within the Gentiles. And as a result, they wanted that jealousy to get them wondering what they had missed, but the Gentiles had gotten. Undoubtedly. You guys with me so far?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have one confirmation. Anybody else? Or you all just kind of spinning your tires back there, wondering where are we going? Okay. And that's what we come back to in verse 12. And yes, I'm only 2 verses in. Paul draws this incredible conclusion here that's absolutely astounding. If the failure of the Gentiles meant salvation, or the failure of the Jews, I'm sorry, I wrote Gentiles there in my notes. Whoops. The failure of the Jews meant salvation for the Gentiles, which it did, then just think about what happens when the Jews are going to be restored to God. You ever consider that? The Jewish diminishing has led to the salvation of the Gentiles. What happens when the Jews finally get included? How awesome is that going to be? Now let's pause there. There's a word that I used that needs to be brought up. The word here is, the ESV translates it failure. And the Greek word for that is hetema, or hetema. Boom, there it is. Hetema, which means defeat or defect. But here in this connotation, it actually carries with it the connotation of diminishing numbers, like there's a plague and people are dying off, and so like the amount of people there is slowly shrinking, or you're in a battle and one side's fighting and one side's winning and the other guys are losing men as they fight because they're getting wiped out by the other army. That's the idea here. They're diminishing. The numbers are getting smaller. The number of Jews who were actually part of the true covenant given to Abraham were diminishing as the Jewish people rejected Jesus on the whole as the Messiah. And this led to the spread of the gospel to the Gentiles. But in the end, God will see Israel restored and saved. And how much greater for all God's children will that be when it's not just either Israel or the Gentiles, but it's all of us. And I said this before back in the beginning part of Romans 9, and I said it again in Romans 10. Here in this passage, verses 13 and 14, this just strikes me as the outpouring of the heart of Paul. You just kind of feel what he feels as he's writing this. I know in the ESV, when you read it, it says, I am an apostle to the Gentiles. But Paul was a little bit of a unique apostle. Most of the apostles were Jews. Paul was a Jew, let's be fair. But the other apostles primarily went to the Jews. That was their initial calling. They stayed within the bounds of Israel and ministered to the church either in Jerusalem or spread throughout all Palestine. Paul was a little different. Other translations of the Bible actually use the terminology the apostle to the Gentiles, and that's not inaccurate to say at all. How about this? Oh,
Hi.
there she is. Paul's relation to the Gentiles was so outstanding by comparison to the other apostles because, for the most part, Paul was pretty much directly responsible for establishing most of the churches outside of Palestine. A vast majority of Gentile believers could probably just point straight to Paul as the reason that they were saved in the first place. And so Paul says, listen, I glorify and I magnify, I rejoice in this fact that I am an apostle, that I am a preacher. I bring the good news of the gospel to the Gentiles. He says, I love that. That's great. That's wonderful. This is my life's joy. But he also says, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. even in understanding the huge role that Paul played in the ministry to the Gentiles, he still admits that he ministers, at least in part, for the benefit of the Jews. In essence, every Gentile that is saved adds to the jealousy of the Jews. Like, there's another one that's following God. There's another one, and there's another one, and there's another one, and another one, and another, and another. Ah! And you've got all these Gentiles that are following God under the banner of Christianity, we'll say. And the Jews can't stand that there's someone that these Gentiles that rival them in trying to in claiming Jehovah as God. And Paul's thinking, if every Jew gets a little more jealous with every Gentile that is converted, maybe if he makes them jealous enough, some of them will come to be saved. That's the idea. Making sense still, guys? Okay. Okay, good. And when I came to verse 15, that was that was an interesting that's an interesting verse to look over. When you look at verse 15, and the first half of the verse, it's very obviously Paul talking about the national rejection of the Messiah by Israel. That's pretty easy to understand. If the rejection means the reconciliation of the world, we're talking about the Jews rejecting Jesus as the Messiah, and thus the gospel comes to the Gentiles. Okay? That's what we're talking about there. That's full enough. But then we get into the second half of the verse, which says, "What will their acceptance mean but life from the dead?" And that's where things get a little muddy. I was reading through my commentaries and such, and I saw several commentaries that went one way with the interpretation of this, and I saw a bunch go another, and I even saw one that basically said, "Look, we don't know what this means, but it's going to be cool, whatever it is. So just appreciate that and don't get bogged down in the details." I am not making that up. That is the paraphrasing of what one of the commentaries said about verse 15. So let's do a little discussion here. Let's just pause here for a few minutes. What do you guys think this is referring to? Not a trick question. I honestly want to know what you guys think. Verse 15, the second half of the verse, when we're talking about this acceptance, what will the acceptance of the Jews mean but life from the dead? What do we think that means? Okay. Watch, I can't tell if you're just dropping a hashtag in there or if that's a preface to actually some sort of explanation.
No, just meaning like we've said throughout Romans, when you take it out of context, it's hard to understand, but in context, it makes sense.
Okay. So what do you think it means in context?
Well, obviously the general meaning that if they accept Christ, then they'll be saved, but I think the rest is coming up.
Okay. Okay, Kessa. You care to go any further with that? Okay. Wasn't planning to go any further. Okay. That's fine. Any other thoughts? It's a pretty good guess. But that's the thrust of the passage. That's what Paul's the The general message is exactly that. This is the Jews have rejected the Messiah, which is not good. But look at all the good that's coming out of it. Look at the Jewish or the Gentiles being saved. So if God's able to take a bad thing like the Jewish rejection of the Messiah and turn it good, how great is it going to be when the good thing, when the Jews recognize their Messiah, how much better is that going to be? Okay. So the two schools of thought here, and I'll just feed this to you. The first one is that there is when the Jews come to recognize their Messiah, there's going to be a worldwide revival. Okay? There's going to be a revival in the hearts of mankind, and so there's going to be this sudden mass spiritual awakening, we'll say. The other school of thought is that when the Jews recognize their Messiah, it is an indication of the resurrection to eternal life. It'll be when Jesus Christ returns, sets up the kingdom as it exists, and ushers in the reign of the Messiah as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so it's not exactly, Bob. Yep, exactly. Yeah, it's Revelation. You wanted a little piece of it? There you go. I was asking a Revelation question. And like I said, there are two different ways of thinking. And even that one commentary admitted, they said, look, this is kind of a vague statement. And we're not entirely sure what it means. It could mean something like one of those two, but we don't know. Don't get caught up in the details, but understand that God is not done with the Jews. God is still working through the Jews, and there is going to be a point where the Jews do come to recognize their Messiah, and that's going to be incredible when we get there. Okay? So I kind of referenced that commentary initially and kind of made it sound like it was the bad guy. It's not really. It's kind of a cop out, but at the same time, I appreciate it because it recognizes that there's a lot of details there that aren't necessarily absolutely vital. It recognizes that the main thrust is that Israel is going to be saved. Israel has not been rejected as God's chosen people. They are going to come to recognize their Messiah, and it's going to be really cool when it happens. Okay? So I encourage study on that yourselves. Come to your own conclusion. There's a reason that I haven't told you what I tend towards, because I don't want to influence your thoughts on that issue, or just try to sway you based upon whether or not it's like if I'm saying it or what have you. I want you guys to form your own opinions. But that's primarily what I saw. Those two different ideologies about that. Okay, we good? No? Yeah?
Good.
Okay. I was going to say, I've got 8 minutes to get this done. And I don't think it's going to happen, but I'm going to give it a go. So that was fun. Let's double down and take a look at the kind of bizarre next statement that Paul makes in verse 16. He says this thing. He says, "If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump." What in the world is Paul talking about? Does anybody know what Paul's on about? Did he just get a little bit, Something about unleavened bread offerings. Stuff David used to take. No. I know what you're referencing there. Nice idea. Not quite. Okay. So nobody knows what Paul's on about here, huh? Holy donuts does sound really good. Sorry, focus. Open a new tab. Here's your next spot we need to go to in your browser. Can I get someone to actually read that passage? Wash. Go ahead, sir.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, When you come into the land to which I bring you, and you will eat of the bread of the land, you shall present a contribution to the Lord. Of the first of your dough you shall present a loaf as a contribution. Like a contribution from the threshing floor, so shall you present it. Some of the first of your dough shall be given to the Lord as a contribution throughout your generations.
All right. So, this is a great example of the Bible being the greatest commentary on itself. Paul's using his pretty extensive understanding of Jewish law to draw a parallel between this Jewish custom and a practical application of the spiritual truth. So what is it we're looking at here? This passage is detailing what's known as a heave offering, which, yeah, I know, it sounds kind of funny. That's what it's called. Essentially, God was laying out for Israel an offering that they were to make to the Lord. Before they were to enter the promised land, God told them that whenever they were going to make bread, they were to offer a small portion to the Lord as an offering of first fruits. And that small portion, this little lump of dough, was considered holy to God. Okay? Okay? No? Yes? Maybe? Okay, sure. Good. Now let's go back to Paul. He says, if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. We're talking about verse 16, fallen. Essentially, what Paul is referencing here is a custom or a Jewish offering that was established back in the book of Numbers. Whenever you make bread, you take a portion of the lump of dough and you offer it as holy to God. You're all caught up now. Good job. Stop. So now we have the context. We understand what Paul's talking about, or where he's talking from. But what's the point he's trying to make? This feels like it came completely out of left field. For one moment, we're talking about how eventually the Jews will be saved and they will come to recognize the Messiah. And the next moment, we're talking about, well, holy donuts. So what's the point? What is this all about here? Any guesses? Okay. Okay, Kessa is on the right track. If we look at the next example that Paul gives, I think it tends to clear up what we're talking about. Because the idea of the dough isn't the first isn't the last one. After that, he says, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. Does that help clear anything up? Can you guys have any ideas about what the illusion is here? Not illusion, but illusion. Okay. Yeah, we weren't going to get that's the next part. I wasn't getting into that, but yes, you're absolutely right. We're talking about grafting. We're talking about branches on a tree. And here's where things get really fun because from the idea of a tree, it's not too much of a logical jump to head over to another symbolic tree, one that we're all familiar with, even in Western culture, a family tree. See, what Paul's doing here is making his case that Israel's time as God's chosen people isn't over. God's not done with Israel yet. And he uses the example of the roots and the lump of dough to support this. In these illustrations, the roots and the lump, this first fruits lump of offering, represent the patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These three men were set apart by God for the establishment of a chosen people. God picked them out and says, I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm choosing you to set up my chosen people. He's okay. Don't worry about it, Kessa. And these three men were, in essence, the first fruits of the nation of Israel. And what's more is that in the image of a tree, these men would be at the base of the tree. When you're looking at a family tree, the eldest ones, the first ones in this family, are at the bottom, near what? The root. So the idea is this: God isn't done with Israel. He set apart the patriarchs to establish a holy nation for the Lord. And since he did that, then he has also set apart those that descended from the patriarchs. That's pretty cool, huh? But even through all that, that still begs a particular question. If the Jews were still God's chosen people, then why didn't they accept the Messiah? If God still chose the Jews, why would God turn to the Gentiles at all? We're going to get to that question next week. But for now, we have the so what. So what? Do you see what God did here? Do you see all of Romans, everything that we talked about coming together here? How this grand scheme has just formed as God has laid it down? The Gentiles were just absolutely despised by the Jews because they were separated from God. They had no desire for the things of God. They were like, ugh, the Jews were all uppity looking at the Gentiles who were heathen, worshiping idols wherever they were. But when the Jews failed to follow God, God brought salvation to those same Gentiles, just like he promised that he would do all the way back several thousand years ago to Abraham, in order to rouse his wayward people to revival. God knew thousands of years in advance and planned it that way, that he would bring glory to the whole world, and his own people who had rejected him would be the instruments of doing it so that he could save them in the end. That's awesome. And through it all, I think two things become incredibly clear. First is that God always gets the glory. And secondly, he sees everything. You guys know I like to write. I love to write. I like to write stories, and particularly adventure stories. It's fun. But I don't think I could have crafted such a wonderful and glorious tale as God did throughout history when I consider how he brought salvation to so many in such a mysterious and unforeseen way. To choose a people only to have them eventually reject you, and then turn the heathen nations, the ones that didn't know you in the first place, and bring salvation to them, to make that same chosen people so jealous that not only would the heathens find repentance and salvation, but so would those original wayward children that you chose. I cannot script that. And then beyond that, you eventually bring them together in a glorious reunion after thousands of years of separation where there was no connection between these people. This is why Paul says so many times that there is no Jew nor Gentile, but we are all one in Christ. It's a tale that spans all of time but finds its completion in the one who transcended time all along. That is a story worth reading. That is a story worth knowing. And that is a story worth living. And you know what the best part is? The story's still going. God is still doing things here. His message to the Gentiles isn't complete yet. And the final salvation of the Jews is yet to come. And we're all a part of God's story. His story. A grand tale of love and loss, of hope and redemption, of reconciliation, and finally, victory. And if we can see God's greatness throughout the pages of history in such a massive and fantastic way, doesn't it make sense that we can trust him with these little stories that we call our lives? God didn't lose sight of the details when he wrote the big story. He saw it all. Jesus said it many times. There's not a sparrow that falls from the nest that God doesn't see. He didn't miss the details. And for me, at least, it's comforting to know that the one that authored the greatest story of all time is also writing my story. And you know what? It ends just as well. Your thoughts, guys. Also, nice timing, Doc. I apologize. I'm apparently a little congested, so